Well, the BBC, if you think the CBC is bad, the British Broadcasting Corporation is worse in so many ways. You know my personal stories about one of their reporters, Dominique Casciani, literally reporting me to police because of my live tweets from court. Just astonishing. I mean, that is so next level. Even Canadian journalists are not that bad. But it's been a bad week or two for the BBC. First, there was a crazy report that one of their flagship programs called Panorama, that's their version of 60 Minutes, that they were caught doctoring a video of what Donald Trump allegedly said on January 6th. And they would cut and splice and hide their edits to use his real words, but take them and rearrange them. An absolute scandal. Here's a little bit of British coverage of that stunning event.
They played the following clip.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell.
But Trump didn't, in fact, say this at all. The BBC spliced together two clips that took place 54 minutes apart. So let's go through it again.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you.
Now, see there, between Capitol and, that's a cut. Here's what Trump actually said.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
It's different. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that he then said the second part of the BBC's version.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we fight. We fight like hell.
It's amazing to me. It took 4 years for that fact to come to light. The BBC, by the way, has a whole block of people they call BBC Verify. These are the fact checkers. For some reason, BBC Verify has not yet verified the lie on Panorama. That's how the week started. But now there's a dossier, a leaked internal dossier by the BBC that acknowledges serious editorial failures in BBC Arabic. As you may know, the BBC operates in many languages. Canada's CBC operates in English and French. The BBC has a large foreign network in Arabic, and you can only imagine who they've been hiring and how that has affected their coverage of Israel and Gaza over the last 2 years. Joining us now from the UK to talk about this is a writer at CAMERA, which is the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. Georgia Gilhooly joins us now. Georgia, great to see you. Thanks for taking the time to be here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Tell me a little bit about the dossier. First of all, who wrote it? I understand it's an internal critique of the BBC. I'm surprised such a thing even exists. Is there, who would be the whistleblower? Who was trying to tell the world, or who was trying to wake up the BBC to its own flaws?
So, of course, we don't know who leaked this. However, it was authored by Michael Prescott. And so he's advising the BBC. However, he's not, an employee of the BBC. So he's someone who's obviously been trusted by them. However, he's not, your run-of-the-mill BBC executive. And as you can see, this memo is pretty damning of how those said executives behave. And so in terms of BBC Arabic, CAMERA for decades has been researching how they behave. So this memo covers the past 2 years. So it's a very sort of minute portion of what's going on. But I say minute, I mean, this dossier details, 500 plus appearances, appearances from people without the context being given that they have made statements that are pro-terror. How can these people be trusted, to commentate impartially on, very sensitive matters in Israel and the Middle East if we know, that that's their angle and they're not pulled up on it? It's shocking if you're not familiar with BBC Arabic, but if you are, it's bad, but you're unlikely to be surprised. I mean, some research that my CAMERA colleagues did this year showed a commentator that was put on to talk, on BBC Arabic about the situation in Gaza. Naturally, he sort of presented a very distorted view of the situation. And we discovered that on social media, he had said the comment, "We shall burn the Jews like Hitler." And we flagged this with the BBC. They said, there's no space for anti-Semitism in the BBC, etc., etc. And then guess what? They used him again the same year.
So was this person who said, we're going to burn the Jews like Hitler, was he only used on BBC Arabic? Was he also on the main English language BBC channel?
I believe he was only used on BBC Arabic. However, you often get sort of a cross-fertilization of, English articles being translated onto BBC Arabic, BBC Arabic articles being translated into English, less so. So I think it's probably unlikely his content was cited, but I think it may have been. I'd have to double check that.
No, that's fine. I was just curious.
It's still the BBC brand. Yeah, it's the BBC brand. It goes out to the whole Arabic-speaking world, which is millions upon millions of people.
Yeah. I mean, it's supposed to be an antidote to the Al Jazeera of the world. Al Jazeera is the state broadcaster for Qatar, which is a clearly pro-Hamas organization. They were really, at the same time Al Jazeera was reporting on Hamas, the regime in Doha was hosting Hamas. I don't think anyone believed that Al Jazeera was anything other than propaganda, but it sounds like BBC Arabic was sort of the same thing. And actually my question on whether or not this same commentator were used in English, it's sort of irrelevant. I mean, in some ways it's actually worse that he was on the Arabic channel, because that, people might look to the BBC, well, what's the Western point of view, or what's the antidote or the counterweight to Al Jazeera? And they're getting people who literally praise Hitler and call for the death of Jews. It sounds like it's as bad as Al Jazeera.
In many ways, it can be. And also, as you're saying, it is a little bit irrelevant as to whether the specific case, was used in their English, news service, because we've seen plenty of similar situations with people who work for the English branch. Not necessarily the exact same comments, obviously, but people who liked posts celebrating October 7th massacre, etc. That's a very common issue we've encountered, and a lot of the time, those people, we can find no evidence that they were fired. And I think that's one of the things about this BBC issue. It keeps rolling on and on and on, and I think people realize, regardless of sort of their level of interest in the Israeli, the Arab-Israeli conflict, I think they realize there's a lot of dissatisfaction around the coverage and there's a lot of errors. And those errors, they very much usually fall on the side of sort of making Israel look bad unfairly. And I think that people never seem to think, to find, that people actually face consequences within the BBC. Who gets fired over these things? We never find evidence that anyone's fired. That's a big problem.
Yeah, well, and just by the way, some of the pro-terrorist commentators, it's not like they were on once in a blue moon. I'm looking at your report. They were on 500 times, 200 times, 250 times. So these were, I can't even think of a commentator who's been on the CBC 500 times. That's as much as a full-time staffer. I mean, like if you're only on once a day, that's daily for 2 years. So these are mainstays. I know that the BBC, like the CBC, has this bizarre policy of not calling Hamas a terrorist group. They say that takes sides, even though legally it is a terrorist group in both the UK and Canada. That is an accurate descriptor of what it does. Like, it's so uncontroversial. It's controversial not to call them a terrorist group. And yet, so they're not terrorists. They won't go that far. But the BBC, and I'm looking at your report here again, it will put scare quotes around, for example, the October 7th massacre at an Israeli town called Kfar Aza. The BBC Arabic
Which is something they haven't apologized for, I believe. They haven't apologized for
so they'd say that's a disputed claim. So they will not accept something that objectively, scientifically, on film happened. They'll call that a disputed claim, but they will run without question that Hamas are not terrorists. It really sounds awful there. Are there any Jews on BBC Arabic? And what I mean by that is there's actually a lot of Jews from Arab lands who were kicked out of those Arab lands, became refugees, and went to Israel. So there's actually a surprising number of Israelis, at least, who are Jewish and speak Arabic. In fact, there's a whole host of Israeli commentators, both in the military and in political circles, who regularly go on Arabic language channels to debate and spar, and I think it's probably a good idea. Do you know if BBC Arabic ever has Arabic-speaking Jews or Arabic-speaking Israelis on for balance? Have you ever heard of that?
I believe that it has happened, but I don't think it's as common occurrence as it really should be. Especially as you're saying, there's so many people in Israel who, speak Arabic. It might even be sort of their first language with their family, and it's unfortunate they're sort of not, being permitted to be sort of part of the Arabic-speaking world, which of course they are. And I think even if they do allow those people a voice every so often, it's not good enough because they're still not reporting the facts. Like, this is a news service. Maybe I should use their sarcastic quote marks around that, a news service. And it's demoralizing because, as you're saying, there are people in the Arabic-speaking world who probably, as you're saying, look to the BBC as some kind of impartial service or something better than maybe what they're getting on Al Jazeera. And maybe they're young people in, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, who don't necessarily align with some of, the anti-Semitic views that are quite common in those parts of the world. And they want to kind of contribute to journalism. Maybe they're interested in going into that. And they think the BBC is a good option. Well, I've got some bad news for them. It's probably not their best option, unfortunately.